Hey, everybody, it's Tommy Canale, and welcome to Before the Lights podcast, the show to find out how those in sports, music, and entertainment made their mark. Go get your coffee or grab a drink and get ready. Joining me today is an Italian-American film director, producer, writer, visual artist, and author. He's known for his documentaries such as Let Fury Have the Hour, Frank Serpico, We're Still Here, Johnny Cash, Bitter Tears Revisited. He founded La Lutta Productions and has produced more than 15 documentaries, films, videos, and visual art pieces. His films have screened at every major film festival around the world and have been produced and released by companies such as Sony and Warner Brothers. Please welcome to the show, Antonino D'Ambrosio. How are you, my friend?
Great to be here with you, Tommy. How are you?
Good. I want to give a special shout out to Bob Delaney for connecting us. Bob is a former guest and a great guy.
Yeah, Bob is I call him Bobby D. He's a real special character.
Yes, he is. Antonino, tell me, what were your childhood influences?
Well, I think the very first thing is, Tommy, is that for me, the experience of being a kid of immigrants was a massive influence on me. Culturally and socially, in terms of how to think about the world, interact with the world. And the reason I say that is that my father in particular was a bricklayer and he didn't speak English. And so when I was 4, 5, 6 years old, he would take me to the job site and I would be his translator. And it was an interesting way. It was, really getting thrown into the deep end of the ocean, of the pool, let's say, to swim, because, I'm a young kid interacting with these adults, all kinds of different folks. And, that experience was like really, really rewarding in terms of how to engage in the world. And it became it really, really launched my love of words in particular, which is the basis of everything I do in music, film, and sports as well. It's learning it, speaking Italian first, and then having to like really, really be super precise in how I interacted with him and helping him, because he relied on me so much, and it was very important for the family. Mm-hmm. And, I remember that being 6 or 7 years old and, after these experiences of being on the job site with all these different groups of people, it was very, very cool. And as I mentioned to you earlier when we were talking before the show, I grew up in Philly, that, I'd go home and write these short stories about my experience. And, but there was a parallel track in that, because I grew up in this neighborhood of Italian immigrants from the same part of Italy.
Which is where?
Kind of followed it was first in West Philadelphia and then Northeast Philadelphia. And then in Italy, the community we were from is called Colli al Vertuno, which is about 45 minutes, maybe an hour north of Naples. And it was a mountain community, it was in the mountains. And we actually moved back for a little while when we were kids, me and my brother, my mother. And that influence was a parallel track with another cultural touchstone for us, which was the love of sports. Sports is a reflection of being part of a community. In particular for us, it was, of course, soccer. So we had the kind of love of soccer following the Italian national team, of course. Italian national team won the World Cup in 1982. It was very exciting to be here in the United States, to see this Italian community really kind of coming together around that. But on the flip side of that, in Philadelphia, a massive touchstone influence on me, really as a creative person as well, and a storyteller, was Dr. J, Julius Erving. And, Dr. J is really one of those special characters in American history. And I remember being young, Tommy, and seeing a quote from him: played with the Nets in the ABA, famous for the fro, but playing above the rim, really the innovator of playing above the rim, famous for the dunk from the foul line, all that kind of stuff that Michael Jordan then would take to other heights. But I remember reading, Tommy, a quote from him that always stayed with me, massively influenced me, allowed me to blend these worlds together: music, which was a massive form of discovery and an exploration of my curiosity was this idea, Dr. J saying that he played basketball like a jazz man, never played the same note twice.
I like that.
And I grew up playing saxophone. So seeing this person who I loved, who was this just fantastically beautiful person in every way in terms of how he interacted with the community in Philadelphia and what he did. He brought us a championship, kind of merged these two worlds that I loved because I love jazz as well, kind of put me on this journey. So I think those are some of the bigger touchstones for me, and, I loved the physicality of how sports in general can be brought into the arts. And one of those early touchstones for me was the martial arts star, Bruce Lee. So I was loving Shakespeare, learning about Shakespeare. I was loving Dr. J, and I was loving Bruce Lee. And it was like merging all these disparate words. Of course, I was also, because I was playing saxophone and clarinet at a young age, I was learning to love Miles Davis and Duke Ellington, and it was an exciting time to kind of, merge all of that. And then years later, bring that to bear in all my films and in my work,
So did the love of writing then originate when you were translating for your father, or did that kind of develop later on?
I think, here's a story I could share with you. My mother was concerned that I spoke Italian only first. And so she would put me in front of Sesame Street when I was 2 or 3 years old. And she discovered that I would turn the TV off and then go into the room and pick up whatever was around and start kind of trying to write. So I think that she noticed that I started seeing that the language that we were living in, which was English, was different than the language that we were speaking at home. And I was trying to find a way to express that middle ground. I think the translating with my father, which was super visceral, obviously, because you're interacting with, and it was like all these men and all these different groups of men, or these different groups of people, all these different parts of Philadelphia and even other parts of the tri-state area that I'd never been to. I'm a kid. I think it kind of inspired me to want to write, and I think that's what set it off. But then I remember really discovering, in particular, I went to a Catholic school in the Philadelphia area, and we started learning about Shakespeare, and they were these kind of truncated versions of the plays. And they were on these, Tommy, they were like terrible, newsprint magazines that came off on your fingers. And I remember reading Much Ado About Nothing, which is, one of his more farcical plays. And it's also set in Italy. And it just reminded me so much of my family, It was a musical quality to writing as well. There was just something about it that, and I tell my daughters all the time, the great thing about your imagination is that it's limitless.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Agreed.
You have to really find those forms to express yourself creatively that make you feel limitless. That's the great thing about being human. If you could dream it, you can make it reality. And, and you could do that in these various mediums that for me, I joined together: sports, music, and film.
You mentioned Shakespeare having some kind of relation to your family. I think as a fellow Italian family, we all have limitless stories that we can write that kind of correlate to different things that maybe other people don't get, but we kind of get ourselves. So I'm following you there. Antonino, how did you get started then in the film business? And for our listeners, what was the breakthrough for you, the aha moment that you went, this is what I'm going to do, and this is why I want to do it?
That's a great question, Tommy. I never really, I went to graduate school at NYU, and when I was 15, my father died, and it kind of changed the course of my life. And I ended up becoming a financial analyst out of college, which was not what I wanted to do. And I worked for a very, very big bank. I got successful, but this was not the path. And I ended up applying to graduate school at NYU as a way to get into the NYU, into the New York City art scene.
Okay.
And I did that. And I went to NYU. While I was there, I was at the film school. I wasn't going to film school. I was going actually to public policy graduate school there. And I happened to be at the film school for some reason. And it's a very prominent film school, TIFF School of the Arts. And I remember that they were looking for someone to direct a short documentary. I'd never even picked up a camera before. I had ripped off the whole flyer so no one else could have access to it. And I presented myself and I got the gig and I made this 10-minute documentary. A couple of years later, and it did pretty well, but it was a small kind of almost PSA kind of thing. A couple of years later, I had the good fortune of meeting Joe Strummer, the lead singer of The Clash, famous punk rock band. I spent all this time with Joe Strummer in New York City, and I took all these notes. And he ended up dying not too soon after I hung out with him, sadly, at the age of 50 years old. And I was maybe at this point 30 years old, and I had all this information about Joe Strummer. I ended up getting a book deal, presented it to a colleague that I knew in publishing. They gave me a book deal. But in the process of writing that book, I met a host of artists and people, all kinds of artists, filmmakers like John Sayles and Jim Jarmusch. But I also became very friendly with Tim Robbins, the actor Tim Robbins. Tim Robbins was coming off. I interviewed him for the book. So there's an essay about that. He was coming off the Oscar for, and I can't recall the film now, sadly, but the film that was set in Boston. He had just won the Oscar. We were meeting in his office, and he talked about my book, and he thought it would make a good film. And I said, "Great. Would you want to do it?" And he said to me, "You should do it." And that's essentially what ended up happening. But it took 7 years. So,
hey, you got there.
Exactly. Thank you. It sent me on a journey. It took me 7 years to make the film, to piece the money together. But it was an amazing experience learning how to do that, to produce, to direct in that way. And then the film became a big hit at the Tribeca Film Festival. And then from them on. And so, but the thing that I think in terms of the aha moment is that we are a very visual culture, and to really translate your particular ideas or stories or things that matter to you. I think the best way to do that is a very powerful, emotional, psychological way to do that is through a visual format in film. And for me, film allows me to bring everything in because it's visual. It's writing. They call it writing with light, but you also have to be a good writer to write, to write the scripts, to write your ideas down into a coherent story that allows you to film it. But my films are very musical. They have a lot of music in it, and so allow me to bring that element as well.
For my listeners that are looking to get into this field, kind of explain to them, what are the hurdles and then / struggles of being a film producer?
The hurdles and the struggles are probably one thing, and it comes, one big thing, which is always money, and I don't want to be,
Well, on that, let's go on this one, Antonino. Then how does a film producer make money? If somebody's looking into it going, I want to do this, explain to them how they're actually going to make money.
So this is good because, I don't want to be kind of like boil it down to something so simplistic or reductive as money, but it ties into your earlier question and to what you're asking now. The key thing is to have a clear vision. You have to know what you want to do, how you want to do it, and you got to be able to carry it off, so it is development, it is producing it, and then implementing it. Because once the film is made, and I feel like this about nearly every creative endeavor, whether you're making a record or you're writing a book or you're making a film, it's never done because if something that's done well, it continues to be made with the audience it finds, but there has to be real intention behind what you're doing. And that requires a great deal of rigorous work. So just like an athlete has to have the fundamentals of playing a particular, whatever sport they're playing, you have to know how to play defense. You have to be, the same thing it applies in the world of film. You have to be able to know to tell the story, whether it's a 3-act structure, all those kind of like fundamental things. And then you can put your own spin on it. I mean, that's where the creativity comes in, the artistry comes in. But I think that first and foremost, you have to have a clear vision of what you want to do. And then coming out of that, particularly for me as an independent filmmaker who has to do, I've been fortunate in my career. I worked with Sony, I worked with IFC, I worked with Sundance. I'm working now with Warner Brothers and HBO, and I have a team, agents and managers, and they help bring things together. But my strength has come from really knowing every aspect of how this game is played, making films, which includes producing. Luckily, I'm a writer, that helps me because I don't need to find that other component of someone that comes in and does that for me. But, once you kind of have a clear vision of how you want to carry this off, this is a very collaborative field. It requires you to work with lots of different people. And that's the next, I think, key step is when you have a clear vision. Who are those people that are going to help you carry out that vision? And it's very much like being on a team. There's got to be, early in my career, Tommy, I did everything. I shot the movie, I edited the movies, I did the sound, that was fool's gold. I mean, if you start things, there's going to be 1, 2, or 3 areas of the work that suffer, quickly I learned that you have to surround yourself with the right people that help you carry this off, and then with that, comes, building the relationships that help you develop a financial structure, because films are not cheap to make,
Speaking of that, what does it cost to make a documentary on an average?
I think if you want to make a high quality documentary, something like, some of the ones that, I've made recently, or something that you're like seeing, let's take, like the Miles Davis documentary, sort of great example on Netflix. I mean, these documentaries range from anywhere from $1.5 million to $3 million to make. In the grand scheme of the film world, that's not a big budget. But in the documentary film world, that's a big budget. And you need that money for various reasons. It's not just for shooting the picture. There's a great deal of real editorial work that needs to be done in the project, which could take time. And that time is where the money becomes very key, because a documentary could take, I mentioned Left Ear, Have Hour, it took me 7 years to make. My Frank Serpico film took me 2.5 years to make. So it can range from 3 years to, 10 years to make a project, and that requires, money. That requires money.
How much research are you doing then? Not so much start to finish, but say from idea, this is the concept I want to do, to actually getting it off the ground.
For me, research is important. So that's something I never take a shortcut in. So I do research continuously. I mean, even when the film is done, I'm still doing research. And what I mean by that is that, there's a whole nother process when the film is done of promoting the movie, and you have to be prepared to answer the questions that have now developed post making the film, because like anything else, these are not static, they move with the time. So you may have started the project like this, like my Frank Serpico film, for example, in 2014, but it came out in 2017. And then we were still promoting in 2018. And the political landscape was different. The cultural landscape was different. So that, for me, it's very, very important that you be able to articulate your ideas in a way that really support the narrative of the film and what you're trying to accomplish, which continue to evolve. If something's done correctly, and this could seem like, a banal statement, but it is timeless. It's like you should be able to pick up this project 50 years from now, and it's just still resonate. And that happens with really real rigorous research from start to finish.
Agree. I'm a big research guy. I love doing research. I think it's what separates those from top to bottom. I don't think there's a middle. I think there's people that don't do it, and then there's people that do it, and then you have to separate yourself from those that do it. And it's big for me. I enjoy it. It's the most enjoying thing I do with this podcast is research all my guests. You have to do it.
I am completely aligned with you on that. In my Johnny Cash book that I turned into a film, I interviewed over 200 people when I wrote that book, and some people would say you don't need to do that, but I felt like, it was very important for me to do that. And one of those people was Pete Seeger, who ended up dying after I wrote the book. And I ended up having all this, all this material with Pete Seeger, so to me, and what you're also talking about, Tommy, the way you described it was beautiful, is hard work. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is hard work, and the hard work will reveal itself in the end product. That's what that's about.
Agree. How do you decide what to leave, for lack of better terms, left on the editing floor and what to keep?
Oh, yes. We call that killing your darlings, right? It's like, it always remains painful, but part of the process of growing as an artist and as someone that does the hard work or the rigorous work is you have to make those decisions. That comes with real rigorous storytelling. My work has a lot of threads to the tapestry. There are multiple storylines going on. That's how I met Bob, who brought me to you, because he spoke in my Frank Serpico movie about his time undercover and his time with post-traumatic stress, which is a thread of the story in Frank Serpico. There's another thread where he becomes famous because of Al Pacino, another thread because, whatever. There's all these different threads. A lot of it is about simple is better. And that is like a mantra of ours when we're working on these projects. The idea of it cramming everything in because you feel like that reveals you to be a great researcher, a great thinker, a great artist is not the way audiences absorb that. It's too much.
You're right.
And so once I realized we need to keep it simple, because that's where the power lies, and also because film is different than writing, and even music. In that regard, you're doing a lot of showing. You don't have to tell as much. And so that's another thing, is that when it starts to feel too, and as my career has progressed, I've experimented with different ways of doing films, and I'm doing a new film on Roberta Flack right now.
I saw that.
The music superstar. And, that's going to be a much more intimate film. Moving, so there's different ways that you tell the story. You stay true to the way you tell the story. And part of that is, you got to have the guts to get rid of things that become a little distracting. There's like great things that happen that you're just like, and sometimes you got to follow that, because then that's the great thing about documentary rather than narrative film, like, dramatized projects, is that the spontaneity or like the ability to move with history is different. And so, sometimes history presents you with something and you have to embrace that and put that in the project, which shifts the project. And that's exciting. So you have to have that built in,
We're going to talk about some of the documentaries you've done in specific here in a minute. But before I forget, for my listeners, in the show notes, I'm going to put links so you can check out all his work. I've seen a lot of them. It's great. He just brought up the Roberta Flack thing that's going to be called Limitless, and I'm excited about this. The film's going to feature Alicia Keys, John Legend, Lauryn Hill, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, Adele, Ariana Grande, Michelle Obama. So if that's not a stud-studded list, I don't know what else is. But Antonino, what is a typical day like for you?
The great thing about doing this work is that, every day, because I'm also working in these different fields, right? Every day is a different day. For example, it allows me to speak to people like you. It's just, that's great, because part of why I do this work is this ability to interact with people that you would never be, normally not be able to interact with.
Right.
Because this work has fingers, it allows you to really reach out and take someone's hand and connect with them like we're doing right now. So, but I start off every day, usually with my daughter, get up with her very early. And then I write for at least an hour. And then, we meet with my production team ranges. Now we're in this COVID moment, so it's a little tricky. So we're never together. We're either doing what you and I are doing, talking like this, So we have about 17 people that work in the production company. There's other projects I'm producing. I'm producing a film on McCoy Tyner, the jazz legend. So what we try to do from day to day is see what project needs the most attention. Because a lot of this work too is keeping the energy of the projects going, because the projects are a little bit of, it's a marathon, not a sprint. So we look at the projects that really need, the focus. Also, something will come up. For example, with the Roberta Flack project, she was awarded a Grammy last year, a Lifetime Achievement Grammy. And that month was January and February. It was right before COVID hit. We hadn't planned to be in LA. We had planned to be somewhere else with, we were actually going to be in Italy for another project. She gets the Grammy. So we have to go there. We go there. I mean, everything changed, like it flipped on its head, right? Mm-hmm. We go there. We're with all these people, some of these people that you mentioned, because I'm with her at the Grammys and the team. That day, Kobe Bryant dies, right? So Kobe Bryant dies. We're at the Grammys. It's the same venue. Lakers fans are marching to the front of the Staples Center in tribute to Kobe Bryant. Behind, all these world famous musicians are going in to the Staples Center for the Grammys. But, we're doing a project with Bob, as we talked about earlier, with the NBA. And that also touched on a project, all of a sudden we were talking to folks at the NBA. We were talking to other contacts we have in the sports world, even though we were there. And so that's the kind of exciting part of it, is that while we have kind of a traditional, let's say, I don't want to say work day because it's never traditional in that way, like 9 to 5, but we have certain moments of production meeting, then, but you have to have this thing built in. Like, for example, Jesse Jackson calling us out of the blue and wanting to talk to me about being in the film. I mean, that doesn't
happen.
Prepared. Yeah, exactly. and that's really, really exciting. That's those moments also kind of, for me, Tommy, are validation and affirmations of why this work is really, I think it's important, but why it's also, it's quite liberating and humanizing, because all of a sudden here I am talking to someone, that, was on the balcony with Martin Luther King Jr., on that tragic day, and you're reminded of how we all are part of history, and we're all part of like this human story. It's exciting.
So you need to be really organized, be able to multitask.
Oh, yes.
And you got to be able to flip and have some flexibility pretty quick if you're going to get into this field.
If if you have any rigidity at all, it would be. Now, I'm also, because I also am a producer, I have to wear both hats. But because I'm, the artist behind the scenes, it just wouldn't work if I wasn't flexible or fluid, because then you would never be able to make anything. It would be you would constrain yourself, and it would be like a tightening of the screw in terms of, you'd never be able to get locked out. You'd be so locked in, to a particular way of working that you can't do that. The other thing is that, because we have such a dynamic group of people, I'm also like leading people. I'm like working with them. They're looking to me, so you have to kind of set that example of what I call creative response. Can't look at things like as an ending when something happens. Because the other thing about making, doing this work, you probably noticed from your own experience, one day you're doing it, and the next day they might call you up and say, can't do this now, which is what happened, quite a bit during 2020, because what can we do? We couldn't film.
Right.
So.
Do you have a proudest achievement to date?
I always say when people, and I know you're not asking me like, what's my favorite film that I made or my favorite book?
Correct.
And I would always say, I haven't made it yet. Because, the idea is that you're always in pursuit of that.
Sure.
So, I always want to stay in pursuit of that. But I have to say that the Johnny Cash project in particular ended up becoming quite a moving experience for me. I became very friendly with the family, with Roseanne Cash and John Carter Cash. And the response to the project within that community, but also the Native community, because it was Johnny Cash's work with civil rights and Native rights. That was pretty humbling, and it continues to have real resonance.
It's very well done.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate that. That's pretty humbling because it put me in touch with a host of people in the Native community that people from the American Indian movement, but also, people like Bob Dylan and Pete Seeger, like I mentioned. And it was a reminder of how important it is to do this work, to have the courage to speak, about things that may seem difficult. And also just, to engage people in this way that's about connecting and not dividing. That remains probably the most humbling experience.
In 1997, you founded La Lutta New Media Collective. You've worked with over 800 groups and has a membership of over 20,000. It's a top independent media group in the country by The Nation. My question might be a little different. The logo is a smile face on an old camera that kind of looks like something we use put up against your face from an eye exam. I love it. Where'd you come up with that?
I have to give... That's a great question, Tommy. I have to give Ben Scanlon, a great artist who's based in San Francisco, all the credit in the world for that. He was visiting the Empire State Building right around then, 97, 98, 99. And it's one of those viewfinders that you look at.
Oh, yeah.
Those old viewfinders?
Yeah, put the quarter in.
Of it. Yes, that's it. And he took a picture of it. And I said, we need to do a logo for La Lutta, something that's fun. And he said, let me take a try. And he presented that one pass.
Wow. First pass.
And I said, we gotta use that. And it's like, everyone loves it, because it's very playful and very,
It is.
Because we want to encourage that, work we do is important, but it's fun and entertaining and engaging. And it's like, I'm glad you saw it as a smiley face. I like that. That's great.
Yeah. Before we go into some of the documentaries, I want to touch on something you did in 2010, and you wrote Mayday. It's imprinted on the back of Shepard Fairey's signature flag print. If you would talk about Mayday and the whole concept that it's on a print.
So I'm glad that you brought up Shepard Fairey. Shepard Fairey and I are close friends. We kind of come from the same punk rock, hip hop, skateboarding community. He grew up in South Carolina and I grew up in Philly, and then we ended up together. I was pretty humbled that he's done all the artwork for all my films and my book covers, all my film posters and my book covers.
Okay.
But he was having a massive exhibit of his newest work in 2010 at the Jeffrey Deitch Gallery in Soho in New York, which is very, very prominent gallery, very important gallery. And he said, I want to do a book together with you, and I'd like you to write the official essay for it. And he said, you can do whatever you want. You can write whatever you want. So I essentially thought about it. Then I wrote, he called me up. He goes, well, it had been a few months. The essays, I need the essay today. And I was like, oh. So I'd been thinking, and my process is taking lots and lots of notes, like we talked about, lots of research, thinking about things. And I ended up writing the piece in 2 hours. And he was like so moved by it that he surprised me at the opening of the gallery. And he said, I printed it on the back of a limited edition prints of this signature piece, which is as you mentioned, the flag, American flag, which was a reimagining of Jasper John's famous American flag painting. And, what I wanted to say in the piece was, I think, the kind of main theme of my work, the importance of having a worldview that it's creative response that moves us forward, and the creative response is, I think, a skill that or a talent that we all have, which is to take our obstacles and turn them into opportunities to make the world work better for everyone. And in that piece, I did like a range, it's like a ranging like story throughout history that kind of ties him, that connects Shepard as part of that creative response movement. And it's a work that continues to be shared and read all around the world, to the point that Shepard, and later on, him and I did another piece together called "We Own the Future," and it became the most asked mural for him to do wherever he went. And he's famous for the Obey logo, which is Andre the Giant. That's his logo, essentially his tag. And I think that the impetus behind it, why I wrote it, was this idea to be for, not against. So much of when we talk about things, people start out by saying, this is what I don't like, this is what I hate, this is what I reject. But taking a different position of saying, what are you for? What are the things that really connect us? And then also looking at things as not as an ending, but as a beginning. This idea of really flipping how we see the world around us, in this way that is not heavy and hard, but a little bit more fun and freeing, because that's also what his art means to me, right? Or someone that does work like that, where he's a graffiti artist. He's using public space, or not public space, but outside, as a public gallery. And I think that is a powerful message to say, creating can bring us together.
Nice work. Nice work.
Thank you.
Let's talk about the Johnny Cash documentary, Bitter Tears Revisited, the 50th anniversary of the controversial recording of the concept record, Bitter Tears, Ballads of the American Indian. It almost destroyed Johnny Cash's career. And I'm going to have you explain that. But the other thing I'd like for you to talk about, Antonino, is how did you find individuals that were relative to this project that were willing to speak?
Well, what's interesting is that, Tommy, in a career, Johnny Cash is like on the Mount Rushmore of American music. I mean, if we did that, Johnny Cash might be one of those faces up there.
Agree.
And it's 1964 when he makes this record, Tommy, but he's known for The Man in Black, all these, that stuff happened in 68. So like what he began, in American popular culture or pop culture, you can become calcified as this one moment, Martin Luther King, I have a dream, that Martin Luther King lived for 5 more years after that, did all this other work. I mean, it goes on and on. I mean, it happens in every field, it kind of really undermines and sells short really how great of an artist and thinker, musician, and world citizen Johnny Cash was. This is what I discovered, because this record was made 4 years before all these records that made him the Man in Black, that we knew as the bad. I'm not sure if I can curse, but as the badass.
No, you can't. You're good.
He was. Thank you. So, and I'll tell you what happened. I was on a book tour for my first book, which also became a film, Left Ear Have the Hour. And I'd happened to have the honor of being Bowling Green University in Ohio. And they had, I traveled the world with this book. And part of what I would do is like stop off at universities and do these really interactive events. And I was doing performances at clubs with artists like Chuck D of Public Enemy and Wayne Kramer of the MC5, a whole range of different folks. And even Shepard Fairey was doing things with me. And in this particular thing, they let me stay there for a week, and I did like a week-long like symposium about this music. And that included, part of the honorarium included me visiting the sound archives. And they have the most prominent and prolific sound archive in the country. And so I asked for like all these records for like original pressings. Duke Ellington. It goes on and on. One was Johnny Cash's Bitter Tears. So as I'm listening to this record, I open the sleeve. I pull the record out of the sleeve, and a piece of paper falls to the floor. I can see, and I'm looking at the piece of paper, and it's a letter Johnny Cash wrote on his official letterhead. Johnny Cash, signature at the top, and at the bottom it said, "Nobody more original than Johnny Cash." And Tommy, the letter was this just indictment of the record industry and the cowardice that they were showing and censoring work around freedom of speech or civil rights, or, because everything was happening in 64. It was the anti-nuclear war movement was happening. Everything was happening in 64. I couldn't believe what I was reading. And it turned out, I saw the whole book in my head when I saw this letter. I said, there's a book here. There's a story here, because it's quite clear. Why is this letter in the sleeve? And it turned out that when Johnny Cash recorded the album in 64, he had been this is a folk record that he made on behalf of Native people and Native rights. He had left Sun Records to go to Columbia with the understanding that Columbia would allow him, since 1960, to make his most ambitious work. He would give them a record they wanted, the hits, and then he would let him do a record he wanted to do. So he did a record called Grand Canyon. It's considered the first spoken word record ever made, for example, right? But they hated these records because they didn't sell. So they kept trying to block him from making, he did like 4 or 5 of these, right? So he has 2 monster hits in 63, including I Walk the Line and Ring of Fire, right? So they couldn't block him any longer. He makes the record. Bitter Tears, Battle of the American Indian. This is in April. In April of 1964, it was white hot. Everything was happening. So there was civil rights. Everything was going on. But Native people were staging what they called fish-ins in support of their fishing rights, which were being blocked and denied to allow sports fishermen to fish. So Marlon Brando had joined in this cause, and he had gotten arrested while Johnny Cash was recording this record in Nashville. He got arrested in Washington participating in the fishing. So this kind of all just added to Johnny Cash's thinking about what to do. So he went off on tour, and he famously plays Newport Folk Festival, where he hangs out with Dylan, and Dylan gives him 2 songs that Johnny Cash ends up recording. They become hits. So in this moment also, this is the famous exchange where Johnny Cash, so he's in a room and people are just like hanging on every word while Johnny Cash and Bob Dylan are on the floor, cross-legged, talking to each other with a tape recorder and exchanging music. Cash leaves the room. He comes back, calls Bob Dylan out, and he gives him his Marshall guitar, which is the highest form of respect in Southern culture a musician can give another musician, right? So this is all happening. While this is happening, the record that he made has been released but censored, right? Radio stations across the country refuse to play. He doesn't know this is happening. So he's doing all this stuff. He finds out this is happening after Newport, and he's not happy about it. Cash flies back to LA where his manager is. He buys all the records back from Columbia. He buys the records. He writes the letter, right? Pays Billboard to put it in Billboard as a full-page ad because they wouldn't have carried otherwise. And he takes he prints out the letter, and himself and his manager puts it in the sleeve of every album. And then he goes back on tour carrying the records, 2,000 of them. And he goes to the DJs and he says, give this record another chance, knowing that they would be too afraid to say no to his face. And he would stay there and make sure they played it. So that's just a little bit of the story that became the book and then became the film. Because what ended up happening is now Sony owns Columbia, the label. As it happens, one of the record heads at Sony Masterworks was someone I'd become friendly with, who invited me in. His name is Chuck Mitchell. He used to run Verb Records. Himself a legendary music. He said, let's right this wrong. Let's do this project, and let's revisit it with new musicians. And we did that. It was really just meant to be a record. But then I went down to Nashville, hung out with Steve Earle, hung out with all these musicians that are on the record, and Lou Harris. I mean, he goes on. And this became the film that you saw.
What are the challenges of a project like that or something like Serpico?
Well, there's always a challenge of convincing certain people that you need to have involved to get the project out, that the project is a worthwhile project. And it's not just financial. Is it a project that fits the moment? And that's a tricky thing because, what's timely or what's timeless, So that's a hard thing to do. So you have to be, and this goes back again to the rigorous research, the rigorous storytelling, the ability to tell a story, for example, my Roberta Flack film. Roberta Flack is when I'm talking to people about the project, she's the only artist to have won Record of the Year, a Grammy for Record of the Year back to back. She's the only one.
Didn't know that.
And it probably will never happen again. No. Because the record industry is not wired like that anymore. Who's going to be sustainable for 2 years anymore? It goes on and on. Or the fact that she lived in the Dakota in New York City and shared the floor with John Lennon and Yoko Ono. So you find a kind of threads, that when you're speaking to people that you really need to help you get the project out there, whether it's another producer or production company, whether it is a distributor, and they all have different, the other thing is that you have to understand, what do these folks need? They're all different needs.
Sure.
A film festival needs something different than a distributor needs, and a particular producer is going to need something different. And the studios need something different, when you're working with the studios, because they have different mandates. So you have to be well versed in who you're talking to about things too. But you have to have a real passion for the project, and the passion that it has to be almost instinctual, where you end up speaking about it and people connect with it in a way where, like, I'm there with you.
Let's end with this question. What drives Antonino D'Ambrosio these days?
I think that I have a 9-year-old daughter, and I'm constantly reinforcing to her to live in the world of creative response and the idea that the imagination is limitless. But she has in turn done something for me, particularly because of this time of COVID, where, things have changed of how we live day to day. That what we can do is really share our joy and our celebration of being alive in this world. And I think that's what drives me. I think all these stories, Tommy, whether it's Left Ear Have the Hour, even my more kind of visual arts films, or Serpico or Johnny Cash, Roberta Flack, the McCoy Tyner project that's coming up, all of them are knitted together with this idea of celebrating life, because that's what these artists ultimately did. You don't sit down at the piano and say, I want to hurt people, for example. They're sitting down at the piano saying, I want someone to hear this song, and it moves them to love someone, to connect with someone, to talk to some, whatever it may be. And I think that's what drives me.
You're paying tribute to these people, and what I've seen is done extremely well. So I wish you nothing but the success. Thank you for coming on my show and talking. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you, Tommy. It was really, really great to talk to you as well. Thank you.
Visit my website, beforethelightspod.com, and click on the Vegas.com banners to get the best deals in Las Vegas. For shows, hotels, and vacation packages, go to beforethelightspod.com. Also go there for show notes on the episode page and links to everything you may want to experiment with or explore a little bit more. Follow us on Instagram at Before the Lights Podcast. Thank you for listening to Before the Lights. I'm Tommy Canale. And until next time, everybody, a salute, a chin chin.